I saw my 72-year-old mother kissing my ex-husband at the altar of the church where I married him 18 years earlier, wearing my grandmother's wedding dress, while my 8 and 12-year-old children threw rose petals for the new union between them. It was a sunny Saturday morning in late May when the thermometer in the central square already marked 28 degrees at 10 in the morning, with a golden luminosity entering through the colored stained glass of the church, creating kaleidoscopic patterns on the marble floor, as if even nature conspired to make that moment even more surreal with its inappropriate beauty. When my family life, already completely destroyed and fragmented by the traumatic divorce 3 years ago that had left me emotionally exhausted and financially fragile, suffered its most surreal, bizarre, and grotesquely perverse transformation. My elderly mother, the woman who had given birth to me 43 years earlier in a public hospital because my father had lost his job in that difficult year, who had breastfed me with her breasts that were now modestly covered by a demure neckline but still inappropriate for her age, who had taught me to tie my shoes and brush my teeth and say my first words, was literally, factually, unbelievably marrying in a Roman Catholic religious ceremony with all the sacramental blessings the man who had been my husband for 15 years of ups and downs, more downs than ups if we're honest, the man who had shared my bed for thousands of nights of conjugal intimacy, who had seen me naked and vulnerable in moments of passion and illness, who had held my hand during the painful births of our 2 children, and who would now simultaneously become, in an impossible family equation to solve, my legal stepfather and foster grandfather of the same children who carried his DNA, in a family configuration so disturbing, unnatural, and psychologically destructive that it seemed to come directly from a Freudian nightmare about inverted Oedipal complexes, or from a case study on generational perversion that would be analyzed by psychiatrists for decades. My mother, Margaret, a woman who has always been vain to the extreme since my earliest childhood memories can reach, obsessed with social appearances and what others will think as a mantra she repeated daily during my childhood and adolescence, with her wrinkled but firm hands holding the bouquet of white roses imported from Ecuador, mixed with lilies that symbolized purity and a cruel irony considering the circumstances, turned slowly to the small audience of approximately 50 people whom she had carefully selected to witness her perverse triumph, her blue eyes scanning the audience like a general inspecting his troops before battle, and declared with a clear, strong, and determined voice that showed no senile tremor or moral hesitation, a voice that cut through the sacred silence of the church like a guillotine blade decapitating family ties. Dear friends, family members, and witnesses of this sacred moment, I want everyone here present to know, understand, and celebrate with me that Roberto has always been, from the first moment I saw him entering my house as my daughter's suitor 20 years ago, the true love of my life, the man I should have met 50 years ago when I still had firm breasts and smooth skin, when I could still give him children who would be ours and not shared grandchildren. But fate, in its mysterious wisdom, wanted us to meet only now, in the golden autumn of our lives, when we finally have the maturity and courage to live the true, pure, and transcendent love that we have always deserved. Regardless of petty social conventions and hypocritical judgments of those who do not understand that true love has no age, no rules, no moral limits when it is genuine. Her carefully rehearsed words, because I knew my mother too well not to recognize when she had prepared a speech in advance, were like consecutive, methodical and surgically precise stabs in my already lacerated chest from 3 years of traumatic divorce, and now from months of progressively more shocking discoveries about maternal betrayal. Each syllable pronounced with the clarity of a professional announcer, and with the unconscious or perhaps deliberate cruelty of someone completely blinded by their own senile selfishness, mixed with inappropriate lust, completely, dismissively, arrogantly ignoring the incontestable and grotesque fact that she was declaring eternal love before God. Saints and men to the man who had shared my bed for 5,000 nights, who had planted his seed in my womb, twice generating my precious children, who had promised eternal love to me at that same altar under the gaze of the same crucified Christ, who now witnessed this sacramental perversion. 18 years before, on a spring afternoon, when I was still young and naive enough to believe that love conquered all. Roberto, for his part, kept planted on his artificially tanned face in tanning chambers that he religiously frequented on Tuesdays and Thursdays, that cynical, satisfied, and slightly cruel smile that I knew so intimately well from our worst matrimonial moments. When he had cheated on me with his secretary 5 years younger, or when he had spent our savings on failed investments without consulting me. clearly savoring every second of the bizarre and perverse spectacle that they had meticulously orchestrated together during the last 8 months of secret relationship that they maintained behind my back, using my own innocent children as alibis and involuntary messengers. His chest puffed with conquering pride like a rooster that had successfully invaded someone else's henhouse, and now ruled over a harem that included mother and daughter in different temporal capacities. Father Antonio, a fundamentally kind middle-aged man who had known our family for decades since the times when my father was still alive and we attended Sunday Mass as a traditional and functional family, who had baptized my 2 children holding their fragile little bodies over the baptismal font while holy water ran down their little heads, who had given me my first communion at 9 years old when I wore a white dress that my mother had hand-sewn for weeks, proceeded with the religious ceremony with visible and palpable moral discomfort, his aged but still firm hands trembling slightly, almost imperceptibly, while holding the sacred book with its time, worn leather cover, and continuous use. The yellowed pages fluttering with the breeze that entered through the side windows of the church, probably questioning internally, in silent dialogue with his conscience and with God, the morality and spiritual legitimacy of blessing such an ethically questionable, morally repugnant, and spiritually blasphemous union between an elderly woman at the end of her life and the ex-son, in law, who had been sacramentally married to her daughter for a decade and a half, who had fathered 2 children baptized in that same church, creating a family configuration that defied not only the laws of men, but certainly also divine laws. I could clearly see in his compassionate but tormented brown eyes that had seen many sins and forgiven many human failings throughout 3 decades of priesthood, that he perfectly recognized the fundamental perversity of that situation, the violation of all moral and ethical codes that his vocation represented, but his canonically established priestly obligation. His vow of obedience to the ecclesiastical hierarchy that had probably been pressured by generous donations from my mother forced him to continue pronouncing with mechanical and emotionless voice the sacred marriage vows that under normal circumstances should celebrate the union of 2 souls, but in that context profaned the sacrament, while my children, seated beside me in their best Sunday clothes that I had bought especially for that damned occasion, watched confused and disturbed as their white-haired maternal grandmother married their middle-aged biological father in a ceremony that completely, irreparably, definitively destroyed any traditional, healthy, or even comprehensible notion of family structure that their young minds might have constructed. The sordid, repugnant, and almost unbelievable story of this supreme maternal betrayal that surpassed the tragedies of Sophocles in its perversity had begun approximately 8 months earlier, during what should have been a simple, traditional, and harmless family Christmas gathering at my mother's imposing house, a 2-story colonial residence with elaborate gardens that she kept impeccably decorated as a permanent theatrical setting for her social pretensions as a grand dame of local society, with authentic Louis XV furniture that she made a point of mentioning to all visitors, Persian carpets that cost the equivalent of an economy car, and artwork by famous local painters that she collected more for status than genuine aesthetic appreciation. Roberto had been invited through a formal call from me to spend the festive date with the children. Since we maintained since the divorce a superficially civilized relationship focused exclusively on the well-being of our children who didn't ask to be born into a dysfunctional family, and my mother, who had always demonstrated during the 15 years of our marriage a poorly disguised hostility, sometimes openly aggressive against him, calling him behind his back, that inappropriate dark-skinned man, or Helena's mistake, surprisingly, shockingly, suspiciously, began to treat him with excessive, syrupy, inappropriate cordiality that should have immediately triggered all my internal alarms if I hadn't been so emotionally exhausted from the recent divorce to notice obvious signs. During the Christmas dinner made with imported turkey, stuffing with Portuguese chestnuts and expensive French wines that my mother served in baccarat crystal glasses, while I helped in the hot and stuffy kitchen preparing the traditional dessert of French toast with port wine syrup that we had been making for 3 generations following my great-grandmother's handwritten recipe, I could observe through the beveled glass door that strategically separated the kitchen from the dining room as if in a perverse aquarium, how my mother and Roberto chatted animatedly with an intimacy that transcended normal family courtesy, her repeatedly touching his arm in a gesture of inappropriate physical intimacy that caused me immediate visceral discomfort, her Dior red-painted nails leaving light marks on the sleeve of his shirt, laughing exaggeratedly, theatrically, youthfully at his unfunny jokes about the financial market and football that I had endured with boredom for 15 years of mediocre marriage, throwing her head back in a performance of senile seduction that would be comical if it weren't my own mother blatantly flirting with my recent ex-husband. Margaret is especially animated and rejuvenated today. "It seems like she took some magic youth potion," commented my younger sister Beatrice as we mechanically washed the Chinese porcelain dishes together on that fateful night that in retrospect marks the beginning of the family destruction, her hands with perfectly gel, manicured nails scrubbing the plates with precise movements to avoid damaging the polish. Her voice carrying an apparently innocent observation that only now, in painful retrospect, seems like a terrible presentiment, a dark omen of what was fermenting beneath the polished surface of family appearances. I haven't seen Mom so cheerful, so full of life, so, how can I say, so feminine and seductive since Dad died 5 years ago. She continued chattering while drying a crystal serving dish, completely oblivious, blind, naive to the disturbing fact that the youth elixir that had transformed our septuagenarian mother was the inappropriate, perverse, incestuous by proximity romantic attention from a man 30 years younger who by grotesque coincidence was my traumatic ex. Husband and father of the grandchildren she claimed to love above all else. Beatrice had undisputedly been the favorite daughter since the cradle. The natural blonde who genetically inherited our mother's penetrating, cold blue eyes and her domineering, manipulative, calculating personality, while I, with my green eyes inherited from my father's side that my mother always said were the color of envy, with my more reserved, introspective, and questioning temperament that she considered problematic, was always treated as the stray black sheep who had to try twice, 3 times as hard to receive half the maternal recognition that Beatrice received simply for existing and validating maternal narcissism with her physical resemblance and psychological submission. During the weeks following Christmas that I now realize were the incubation period of the grotesque romance, I began to notice strange behavioral changes, subtle but progressively more obvious in both Roberto and my mother, which, in isolation, seemed like innocent coincidences or natural changes of middle age and old age, but together formed a disturbing, nauseating, undeniable pattern that my brain in protective denial stubbornly refused to fully process because the truth was simply impossible to accept. Roberto, who normally picked up the children on Friday evening at 6 o'clock sharp and returned them on Sunday after lunch at 2 o'clock as judicially established in the divorce agreement, began systematically extending the visits until Sunday night, sometimes even Monday morning, always with the elaborate and seemingly reasonable excuse that he was taking them to visit Grandma Margaret, who supposedly felt desperate longing for her grandchildren, and whose advanced age required that we take advantage of every possible moment with her. My mother, for her part, began making dramatic, almost caricatural changes to her physical appearance which, after decades of modest widowhood and dignified aging, suddenly seemed straight out of a How to Look Young After 70 manual. She cut her hair that she had kept in the same bun style for 30 years and dyed it in a modern platinum shade that cost a fortune at the salon of the local celebrity's hairdresser, started wearing visibly more youthful, colorful, and revealing clothes, including blouses with necklines that showed her wrinkled chest now decorated with new gold and diamond necklaces, and more disturbingly, more grotesquely, underwent invasive facial aesthetic procedures including Botox, lip fillers, and a mini facelift that clearly, desperately, pathetically were intended to disguise her 72 years of age in a futile but determined attempt to appear younger, more attractive, more sexually viable for someone, and that someone I now knew was my ex-husband. "Mother, you look different," I cautiously observed during a forced Sunday lunch in late February when the summer heat made the dining room stuffy despite the air conditioning, trying to maintain a casual and disinterested tone, while my mind processed with growing horror the vibrant red Chanel lipstick she wore, completely inappropriate for a woman of her age and respectable widow status, the intense floral perfume that emanated from her in sickening waves, the silk dress that highlighted a body that should have been covered by the dignity of age. After much reflection, I decided that life is too short and precious not to enjoy every moment intensely. "My daughter," she replied with an enigmatic, aging Mona Lisa smile that did not reach her calculating blue eyes that evaluated me like a predator assessing prey, measuring my reaction. At 72, I discovered through a wonderful epiphany that I still have much love to give and especially to receive. And I will not waste another precious day behaving like a reclusive grieving widow just because hypocritical and ageist society expects that from me. Her words sounded at the time like a senile declaration of independence, a geriatric rebellion against social conventions, But now I realize with painful clarity that it was a veiled confession, an encrypted warning about the secret, forbidden, incestuous by extension relationship that was already developing with my ex-husband behind my back in the wings of our family life, using my own innocent children as unwitting accomplices in their clandestine meetings disguised as innocent family visits. The first concrete, undeniable, devastating evidence that something deeply wrong, perverse, unforgivable was happening emerged on a rainy and melancholic March afternoon when the gray sky seemed to reflect my depressive mood, when I decided on impulse to make a surprise visit to my mother's house to pick up a Portuguese ceramic cake mold that I had lent weeks before for a birthday, and that she conveniently forgot to return despite my polite reminders. When I turned the corner and parked my modest compact car on the street in front of her imposing house, I immediately noticed with a knot in my stomach that turned into nausea Roberto's silver sedan parked shamelessly in the covered garage. The same executive car that I had helped choose and finance 5 years earlier, when we were still married and pretended to ourselves and to the world that our deteriorating relationship could be saved with expensive couple therapy and mutual effort that we never really made. My heart began to progressively accelerate as I walked slowly, reluctantly, like someone approaching their own scaffold, along the Portuguese stone path of the elaborate garden, the fine autumn rain wetting my face and organically mixing with the first tears of premonition, fear, and denial that were beginning to form involuntarily in my eyes already tired of crying. Because my children were definitely in public school at that time on Thursday at 2 in the afternoon, and there was absolutely no legitimate, innocent, or acceptable reason for Roberto to be in my mother's house alone with her on a weekday during business hours, when he should have been in his mediocre financial consulting office. I used my key worn by use to enter silently like a thief into my own mother's house through the wooden back door that creaked if opened quickly, but could be opened silently if done with patience. The door that gave direct access to the kitchen with its blue and white Portuguese tiles, the same familiar path I had used thousands of times during my lonely childhood and turbulent adolescence, when I returned from school finding my mother preparing dinner with military precision and constant criticism about my appearance, my grades, my inadequate friendships. The house was strangely, suspiciously silent except for muffled but distinguishable voices coming from the living room. Voices that I immediately recognized with growing horror as being Roberto's and my mother's, talking in low, intimate, conspiratorial tones that suggested a completely inappropriate, unnatural, perverse closeness between mother, in-law, and ex-son-in-law who should maintain respectful distance after the divorce. I walked with extreme care toward the living room with calculated ballerina steps to not make noise on the noble wooden floor that creaked in specific spots that I knew by heart after 4 decades, my heart beating so strongly, so violently that I was absolutely certain they could hear the frantic drum in my chest through the walls. And when finally, inevitably, I peeked through the half-open mahogany door with Baroque carvings, the domestic scene I witnessed was permanently, indelibly engraved in my memory with the terrible clarity of trauma, as the exact, precise, definitive moment when my relationship with my mother died a violent and irreversible death. Roberto was sitting comfortably, proprietarily on the beige velvet sofa imported from France that my mother had recently purchased for a small fortune in a clear attempt to renew the environment to impress someone, and she was sitting beside him in a physical proximity that completely, categorically eliminated any doubt about the intimate nature of their relationship. Their intertwined hands rested on her lap, covered by a skirt that revealed knees with varicose veins, his fingers caressing hers with practiced familiarity. And she had her gray head resting on his shoulder in a touching and nauseating pose of adolescent intimacy that would be ridiculous if it weren't so grotesquely inappropriate, considering she was old enough to be his mother, and was literally the mother of his ex-wife. They weren't passionately kissing or in any explicitly sexual act that could be dismissed as a moment of weakness or temporary madness, but the serene domestic intimacy of that scene, 2 comfortable, secure, established lovers in each other's presence, with no need for dramatic words or theatrical gestures to validate their connection, was more devastating than any pornographic erotic flagranti could have been, because it unequivocally demonstrated that this wasn't an impulsive affair born of loneliness or momentary error of judgment, but a deep, established, consolidated relationship that had clearly been developing for enough time to reach this level of mutual comfort, naturalness, and domestic intimacy that takes months to build. My first primitive, visceral instinct was to burst into the room like an avenging fury and confront them with hysterical screams and dramatic accusations, transform that rainy and melancholic afternoon into an explosive melodrama worthy of the worst Mexican soap operas that my mother religiously watched every afternoon while knitting. But something deep held me back. Perhaps it was the absolute paralyzing shock of seeing my own mother, the woman who gave birth to me, betraying the most fundamental and sacred family trust. Or perhaps it was the psychological need to completely, rationally process what I was witnessing before reacting emotionally and doing something irreversible. I silently retreated as I had entered, left the house with the same furtive care of a spy in enemy territory, got into my car and drove automatically, robotically to an empty and desolate parking lot of an abandoned supermarket, where I finally allowed myself to explode into convulsive, primitive, animal tears that lasted for almost an uninterrupted hour. My entire body violently shaking with the seismic magnitude of the betrayal I had discovered. The incomprehensible perversity of a mother who was literally stealing her own daughter's ex-husband in a sick generational inversion of family roles that violated all natural and divine laws. During the 3 days that followed, which felt like 3 years, I lived in a state of active, desperate denial, trying to convince myself through elaborate mental gymnastics that I had misinterpreted the situation, that perhaps they were just developing a platonic friendship based on their shared love for the children, that my mother would never, ever, under any circumstance, be capable of such a fundamental betrayal of the sacred maternal bonds that should be unbreakable. But the evidence kept inexorably accumulating like an inevitable avalanche of painful truths. Text messages that Roberto constantly received and read with malicious smiles he never displayed during our dying marriage. The distinctive floral feminine perfume in his car that I immediately recognized as the expensive Chanel No. 5 that my mother wore on special occasions, and especially, most disturbingly, the way my innocent children began to speak with increasing naturalness about the fun outings they had with their father and grandmother together, always to romantically suggestive places like elegant candlelit restaurants and picturesque parks at sunset that were clearly settings for romantic encounters disguised as innocent family outings. The inevitable, unavoidable, and explosive confrontation happened on a gray Sunday in April, during the monthly family lunch that my mother insisted on maintaining as an inviolable sacred tradition, an elaborate 4-course meal served on Chinese porcelain, where she exercised her absolute matriarchal control over the family through subtle criticisms disguised as maternal concern and sophisticated emotional manipulation, presented as unconditional love. I waited strategically, calculatingly until after the milk pudding with wine-soaked plums dessert, when the children were released to play in the backyard with their electronic toys, and Beatrice had discreetly left to smoke her secret mint cigarette that we all pretended to ignore. She had been smoking compulsively since college, leaving only me, my mother and Roberto in the oppressive dining room with its antique jacaranda furniture inherited from my paternal grandmother, and faded floral wallpaper that hadn't changed in 30 years because my mother considered it timeless classic. "I know about you too," I suddenly declared in a firm, clear voice that surprised even myself by its lack of tremor, placing my inherited silver fork on the porcelain plate with a deliberate metallic clink that echoed through the sudden silence like a bell announcing an execution. "I know you're having a sordid affair. I know you're betraying me in the cruelest way possible. And I know you're using my children as alibis for your disgusting meetings." The words came out like projectiles, each one aimed with surgical precision. Their reaction was instantly revealing of their fundamental personalities. Roberto immediately, predictably averted his cowardly gaze toward the window, as he always did when caught in lies during our failed marriage, his eyes searching for an escape route that didn't exist. While my mother, with the audacity that had always characterized her domineering personality for as long as I can remember, raised her chin defiantly like a queen facing rebellious peasants and stared at me with her arctic cold blue eyes that had so often judged me insufficient throughout my entire life. "And what exactly do you think you know, Helena?" she asked with that condescending tone of superiority she had used since my childhood, whenever I dared to question her absolute authority over all aspects of family life. "I know you're having an affair, Mother. You, a 72-year-old woman who should have dignity and self-respect, are literally sleeping with my ex-husband, the father of your grandchildren, the man who shared my bed for 15 years, who watched me give birth to your grandchildren, who swore eternal love to me in this very setting 2 decades ago," I replied, my voice trembling now not from fear or insecurity, but from pure, incandescent anger that boiled in my chest like corrosive acid dissolving decades of filial submission. Affair is such a vulgar and inadequate word to describe what Roberto and I share, Helena. My mother responded with the studied and calculated calm of someone who had mentally rehearsed this conversation multiple times in front of her bedroom mirror. Roberto and I discovered through the forced companionship of family circumstances that we have a deep, spiritual connection, something transcendent that overcomes petty social conventions and superficial moralistic judgments of small minds. True love, my ungrateful daughter, does not choose age, circumstances, or family approval. It simply happens as a force of nature, and we fought against it for months before surrendering to the inevitable. Her words were so absurdly pretentious, philosophically empty, and disconnected from the grotesque and perverse reality of the situation that for a delirious moment, I thought she might be suffering from some kind of progressive senile dementia, preventing her from understanding the magnitude of the moral perversity of what she was doing. Roberto finally found his cowardly voice and added with that characteristic cowardice he always demonstrated in direct confrontations during our marriage. Helena, you need to understand that we didn't plan this. It simply happened naturally. Margaret understands and accepts me in a profound way that you never understood or tried to understand during our failed marriage. She sees me as I really am, not as you wanted me to be. The discussion that followed was a nuclear explosion of decades of resentments accumulated like toxic sediments, unexpressed frustrations that had rotted in silence, and painful truths that had been buried under geological layers of forced family politeness and social appearances. I accused my mother with words that cut like razors of having always pathologically envied my youth since I became a teenager and tried to compete with me as if we were rivals rather than mother and daughter, of having systematically sabotaged my marriage with constant criticism, manipulative interference, and seeds of discord strategically planted to now steal the wreckage of the failed relationship, like an emotional vulture feeding on family carrion. She retaliated with distilled venom, saying that I had always been an ungrateful daughter who did not value the monumental sacrifices she had made to raise me after my father died leaving debts, that my marriage had failed spectacularly due to my own fundamental incompetence as a wife and not due to external interference, and that she rightfully deserved to find happiness and passion at the end of her life, even if it meant breaking hypocritical social conventions created by jealous and bitter people like me. "You are irreparably destroying our family," I shouted in desperation, hot tears of anger and frustration streaming down my face as I rose from the chair with such violent force that it fell backward with a crash against the wall. My children will grow up psychologically destroyed with what kind of aberrant example? Their grandmother married to their father? This is sick on levels that transcend any perversion, Mother. It's grotesque and unnatural on levels that you stubbornly refuse to acknowledge because you're blinded by your senile lust. But my mother, with that glacial emotional coldness that had always been her cruelest and most effective characteristic as a psychological weapon, simply methodically adjusted the Irish linen napkin on her lap and responded in a modulated voice as if discussing the weather. Children are infinitely more resilient and adaptable than you imagine with your characteristic pessimism, Helena. Sophia already naturally calls me Mommy Margaret sometimes when she's with Roberto, showing admirable adaptability, and Lucas is gradually beginning to accept that his family is special, unique, and different from other conventional families. They will grow up more tolerant and open-minded because of this experience. The casual revelation that my children were already being systematically conditioned, manipulated, and indoctrinated to accept that aberrant and psychologically damaging situation as normal was the devastating final blow I needed to make the most difficult and painful decision of my maternal life, to completely, definitively cut contact with my mother and drastically limit through legal action my children's interaction with Roberto. But I quickly discovered through expensive legal consultations that the patriarchal judicial system strongly, almost absolutely favors paternal rights regardless of moral circumstances. And Roberto, advised by a competent and expensive lawyer whom my mother was obviously financing with her considerable fortune, managed to maintain his regular visitation rights established in the divorce. The legal battles that followed were financially draining and emotionally devastating, consuming my limited savings as a teacher and my vital energy as I desperately tried to protect my children from the irreparable psychological damage of growing up in such a grotesquely dysfunctional family structure that seemed to have come from a psychiatric case study on family perversions. During the hellish months that followed, while Roberto and my mother made their relationship increasingly public and brazen, appearing together at social events as an established couple, I had to watch helplessly as my children were exposed weekly to this disturbing and psychologically destructive family dynamic. Sophia, with her 8-year-old innocence protected by the developmental inability to fully process adult perversity, couldn't understand why I became visibly sad and sometimes cried when she excitedly talked about the fun outings with Daddy and Grandma at the mall, the cinema, the amusement park, while Lucas, older and painfully aware of the grotesque abnormality of the situation, began to show worrying signs of severe emotional stress. His grades at school dropped drastically from exemplary student to mediocre. He became progressively withdrawn and occasionally aggressive with peers, and began having terrible recurring nightmares that made him wake up screaming, "No!" in the middle of the night, soaked in cold sweat. The last straw that forced me to accept attending their cursed wedding was a masterfully cruel emotional manipulation maneuver orchestrated by my mother with the precision of a military strategist. She systematically convinced the children through subtle brainwashing that if I didn't attend the ceremony, it would be because I no longer loved the family, and maliciously wanted to destroy everyone's happiness out of pure envy and bitterness. Sophia came home one rainy Friday, 2 weeks before the scheduled wedding, crying copiously with sobs that shook her fragile little body, and hugged me with desperate, childish desperation. "Mommy, please. Grandma said you don't want to go to her wedding because you don't like us anymore, because you're angry with the family. I promised her I would convince you to go because I want our whole family together, even if it's different and special compared to other families. Please, Mommy, go for me." How could I deny this desperate and manipulated plea from my 8-year-old daughter without appearing as the cruel villain of the story? How could I explain to an innocent child that her grandmother was criminally using her as a tool of emotional blackmail to force me to publicly validate her perverse union with my ex-husband? Beatrice, my younger sister who has always lived in a bubble of emotional privilege, tried to mediate the situation with the well-intentioned but deeply ignorant naivety of someone who had never experienced true, visceral betrayal. "Helena, I know it's strange, bizarre, and even somewhat disgusting to imagine 72-year-old mom with 45-year-old Roberto. Her wrinkles with his vigor, but they seem genuinely happy and in love together. Perhaps you should try to accept this new reality for the psychological well-being of the children, to avoid traumatizing them even more with family conflicts." Her well-intentioned but profoundly blind words about the seismic magnitude of the betrayal made me feel even more isolated in my justified horror, like someone screaming about a fire while everyone ignores the smoke. How do you explain to someone who has never had an ex-husband literally stolen by their own mother how much it destroys not only the present and future, but also retroactively contaminates, like radiation, all family memories of the past, transforming every family photo, every celebration, every shared moment into a grotesque lie? The preparation for the cursed wedding was a spectacle of senile bad taste and vulgar ostentation that my mother orchestrated with the manic enthusiasm of a 20-year-old virgin bride at her first wedding. She spent an obscene small fortune on multiple wedding dresses that pathetically tried to disguise her 2 years of wrinkles and flaccidity, hired a wedding planner known for organizing extravagant events for local celebrities and corrupt politicians, and most perversely, had the psychopathic audacity to ask me to be her maid of honor, because it would be a gesture of emotional maturity and Christian forgiveness that would show all of society that we are an evolved and modern family that transcends outdated conventions. The surreal perversity of asking me to literally hand over my ex-husband to my own mother at the sacred altar was so absurd that it bordered on Kafkaesque surrealism, but I ended up accepting under coercion when Roberto threatened through his lawyer to further limit my already reduced time with the children if I caused problems or created unnecessary drama during the wedding period. The hellish weeks preceding the ceremony were a Dantesque emotional purgatory where I had to feign impossible normality, while my mother animatedly discussed the sordid details of the wedding in front of me with no awareness, as if there was nothing extraordinarily wrong, perverse, and morally abominable about marrying her daughter's ex-husband. She showed me wedding cake samples, asking my opinion on flavors and decorations, discussed elaborate floral arrangements as if I were a close friend and accomplice rather than the daughter she was deeply betraying, and more disturbingly, more sadistically, talked about the 2-week honeymoon they planned at a 5-star romantic resort on the northeastern coast. The same paradisiacal resort where Roberto and I had spent our 5th wedding anniversary in a desperate and failed attempt to revive our dying relationship through forced sex and silent dinners. "Do you think I should wear traditional pearls or modern diamonds on the big day?" my mother casually asked me during one of the pre-nuptial tortures at an expensive jewelry store in the mall. holding two absurdly expensive necklaces against her wrinkled, flaccid neck while admiring herself in the mirror with senile vanity. Wear a dog collar. It would be more appropriate for your age and the situation, I thought venomously but didn't say, maintaining the forced Mona Lisa smile that had become my permanent mask during those hellish months of preparation. The diamonds match your skin tone and dress better, mother, I replied in the neutral, dead voice of someone completely dissociating from reality to survive the ongoing trauma. She smiled with satisfaction like a cat that ate the canary, completely oblivious or more likely indifferent to the profound suffering she was causing me with every detail of that matrimonial farce. Each preparation that transformed perversion into public celebration. The wedding rehearsal on the eve of the ceremony was particularly cruel in its forced normality, because Roberto insisted with sadistic determination that the children actively participate as page boy and flower girl, transforming my own innocent children into unwilling and public accomplices of the union that destroyed any sense of family normalcy we were still desperately trying to maintain for their psychological well-being. Seeing Lucas, my 12-year-old son already entering turbulent adolescence, carrying the golden rings on a small white satin pillow embroidered with intertwined initials that formed a perverse monogram, while his young face clearly demonstrated through every tense muscle the profound discomfort, existential confusion, and shame he felt, was one of the most painful and heartbreaking images of my maternal life. Sophia, on the other hand, was genuinely enchanted with her princess pink dress with multiple layers of tulle that twirled when she spun, and with the attention she received from all the adults who commented on how beautiful she looked, without understanding in her protected innocence that she was actively participating in a ceremony that would transform her into a genealogical anomaly. Simultaneously, granddaughter and stepdaughter of the same person in a family configuration worthy of psychological studies on extreme generational dysfunction. During the luxurious rehearsal dinner at a sophisticated Michelin-starred restaurant that my mother had reserved to impress the selected guests, I was forced through social protocol to sit at the main table of honor next to the happy couple, while distant relatives I hadn't seen in years, and my mother's senile friends who barely knew me, made elaborate and pretentious toasts celebrating the love that knows no barriers of age or convention, and the admirable courage to find happiness in the golden years despite social prejudices. Each toast was an additional refined torture. Each word of celebration was a cutting reminder that I was completely, absolutely alone in my perception of the fundamental perversity of that situation that violated all natural laws of family decency. Father Antonio, strategically seated across the oval table, occasionally shot furtive, compassionate glances at me over his reading glasses, suggesting that he too viscerally perceived how morally wrong that union was, but his hierarchical religious position and probably ecclesiastical pressure obliged him to maintain official diplomatic neutrality. I want to make a special and personal toast. Roberto stood up holding his expensive Veuve Clicquot champagne flute that sparkled under the crystal chandeliers. His face flushed from the alcohol consumed and from the narcissistic excitement of the moment of attention. For Margaret, the extraordinary woman who showed me that true love can flourish at any age and adverse circumstance, who taught me that passion has no expiration date, and for Helena, my dear ex-wife, for her admirable emotional maturity in accepting our happiness and attending as maid of honor, demonstrating that we are all civilized adults capable of transcending pettiness. The poisonous cynicism of including me in the toast, transforming my forced and tortured presence into a public approval of their relationship, made me grip the crystal glass so tightly that I seriously feared breaking it and cutting my hand, which would at least be a real physical pain to contrast with the unbearable emotional pain. The morning of the cursed wedding arrived with an ironically, sadistically perfect sky, without a single cloud to stain the cerulean blue, as if even the weather was actively conspiring to make that day even more unbearable, with its beauty inappropriate for such a morally grotesque occasion. I woke up at 5 in the morning after a sleepless night populated with nightmares where my dead father appeared crying and asking how I had allowed such abomination to happen. I mechanically put on the navy blue Chanel dress my mother had chosen, an elegant but sober piece that cost the equivalent of 3 months of my salary, and that she said would not compete with the bride's radiance, but that in reality was a uniform of public humiliation, and looked at myself for a long time in the bathroom mirror seeing a 43-year-old woman prematurely aged by 10 years due to accumulated stress, systematic betrayal, and continued humiliation that I had experienced in the last infernal months. My green eyes, which Roberto used to say were my most beautiful feature when we still pretended to love each other, were opaque and dead like those of a fish on ice, surrounded by deep, dark circles that no expensive makeup could completely disguise. The children arrived with Roberto an hour before the scheduled ceremony, him honking impatiently in front of my modest house as he always did to demonstrate that he wouldn't enter my territory. Seeing my ex-husband through the living room window in his impeccable Armani tuxedo, preparing to marry my septuagenarian mother, while adjusting our son's silk bow tie with the same hands that had caressed me thousands of times, was surreal beyond any adequate description in human words. "You look, well, Helena," he had the grotesque audacity to say when I went out to get the children, as if we were a normal family preparing for a happy festive occasion, instead of involuntary participants in an unprecedented generational perversion. "Lucas, don't forget to smile when delivering the rings. And Sophia, throw the petals slowly so they last until the altar." He instructed our children with the naturalness of someone asking them to tidy their rooms, completely ignoring that he was asking them to actively participate in the destruction of a normal family structure. Lucas just nodded mechanically, his young face a mask of resignation that no 12-year-old child should need to wear, accepting the unacceptable because he had no choice, while Sophia jumped excitedly in the backseat of the car, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding, humming a school song about happy families in a cutting irony that made me swallow tears. My mother arrived at the church in an extravagant white limousine decorated with floral arrangements that must have cost more than many people earn in a month, an unnecessary and vulgar ostentation that demonstrated her pathological and senile need to transform that aberrant marriage into a princely celebration worthy of royalty, as if the pomp could somehow legitimize the moral perversion. When she got out of the car with the help of the uniformed driver, wearing her pearl-colored wedding dress with French lace details and a vintage veil that had belonged to my grandmother, the same religious and traditional woman who would have been absolutely horrified by the moral degradation that her daughter was committing against her granddaughter. She looked like a grotesque and pathetic caricature of a young bride, an antique porcelain doll desperately trying to look young. The professional photographers she had hired at great expense immediately began firing their expensive digital cameras, capturing for posterity and perverse family albums the surreal image of a 72-year-old woman dressed as a virginal bride about to marry her own daughter's 45-year-old ex-husband, as if it were something to be celebrated, preserved, and shown with pride to future generations who would ask in horror about that genealogical anomaly. "Helena, dear daughter, could you hold my bouquet while I adjust the veil with hairpins?" My mother asked me with the practiced naturalness of someone making a simple, everyday request, completely oblivious or more likely sadistically indifferent to the perverse and cruel symbolism of making me hold the flowers for her wedding to my ex-husband, the man with whom I shared 15 years of my life. I took the heavy bouquet of imported white roses and lilies that symbolized purity in a biting irony, with trembling hands that could barely hold the arrangement, the sweet and sickening perfume of the flowers causing me instant and violent nausea that I had to control with deep breathing, while she meticulously adjusted her vintage veil with the help of a professional hairstylist who prattled on about how beautiful and radiant she looked for her age, not knowing she was styling a bride who had stolen her own daughter's husband. The procession to the altar was definitely one of the most surreal, painful, and psychologically destructive moments of my adult life. I walked in front as a reluctant and coerced bridesmaid, each of my steps in the nave of the centuries, old church echoing like a medieval funeral drum announcing the definitive and irreversible death of any normal relationship with my mother, followed by little Sophia scattering red and white rose petals along the aisle with genuine childish enthusiasm, occasionally twirling to see her dress spin, and Lucas carrying the golden rings with the weight of the world on his young shoulders, already bent by psychological burden. Behind us, at a distance calculated for maximum dramatic impact, my mother walked alone with determined and decisive steps. She had categorically refused Beatrice's suggestion to accompany her because she wanted to show her feminine independence and personal strength to the world, with the erect posture of someone who had waited 72 years to experience her great love, even if that love was built on the emotional ruins of her own daughter. Even if each step toward the altar was a step on the corpse of our mother-daughter relationship. When we finally reached the altar decorated with monumental arrangements of white flowers that seemed ironically appropriate for a family funeral, and I saw Roberto waiting with that self-satisfied and smug smile that irritated me so much during our failed marriage, The complete and devastating reality of the moment hit me with the force of a tsunami. I was literally, factually handing over my traumatic ex-husband to my elderly mother in a Catholic religious ceremony that would permanently, irreversibly transform our already dysfunctional family dynamic into something even more perverse, sick, and psychologically destructive for everyone involved, especially for my innocent children. Father Antonio began the ceremony with words about divine love, sacred commitment, and celestial blessings that sounded empty, inadequate, and even blasphemous for that unnatural union that violated all the moral precepts that the Church itself defended. His elderly hands holding the sacred Bible trembling slightly, as if even the Holy Book rejected participating in that sacrilegious matrimonial farce. It was exactly at this moment of maximum electrical tension that Sophia staged the scene that crystallized all the perversity of the situation. Running down the central aisle with her brown curls bouncing, her pink dress fluttering like fairy wings, to embrace Roberto's legs with childish force and shout in a crystalline voice that echoed through the perfect acoustics of the church. "Grandpa Roberto, now you're going to be my real grandpa forever and ever." The generational confusion expressed with childish innocence perfectly summarized the family chaos we were experiencing, the complete destruction of normal family roles. The guests, mainly octogenarian friends of my mother who didn't know the complete story, found the gesture touching and applauded enthusiastically, some even wiping away sentimental tears, without realizing they were witnessing an 8-year-old normalizing a deeply dysfunctional and psychologically damaging family structure. From the innocent lips of children comes the purest truth. My mother seized the moment with theatrical opportunism, taking the golden microphone with an artificially emotional voice. "Sophia, darling, my little angel, yes, Roberto will be your very special grandpa now. A grandpa who was also your daddy, and we will all be an even more united, modern, and happy family, a 21st century family that doesn't cling to outdated conventions." The blatant emotional manipulation of using my innocent daughter as public validation for his grotesque marriage made me feel such intense volcanic rage that I had to dig my nails into my palms until nearly drawing blood to stop myself from screaming the naked truth to everyone present, that this senile woman had calculatedly seduced and stolen her own daughter's ex-husband in a display of pathological selfishness and maternal cruelty, unprecedented in the history of family perversions. The matrimonial vows that followed were an additional exquisite torture to hear, each word a blasphemy against family decency. Roberto, reading from a crumpled paper that my mother had clearly edited, declared with the affected voice of an amateur actor, "Margaret, light of my autumn, you showed me that true love has no age or conventions, knows no moral barriers when genuine. In these magical 8 months together, I discovered in you the partner I had always unconsciously sought. Someone who understands me deeply and accepts me completely with all my flaws." Each word was a dishonest and revisionist rewriting of our family history, cowardly erasing the 15 years he had spent with me, the painful childbirths I endured to give him children, the sleepless nights caring for feverish babies, transforming my senile mother into the romantic heroine of a story that was in reality a moral tragedy of Greek proportions. My mother, in turn, had memorized her vows, which she recited with the clarity of a Shakespearean actress, without consulting any paper, demonstrating that she had obsessively rehearsed that moment. "Roberto, my late but true love, you brought golden light to my final years that I thought would be filled with loneliness and decline. You made me feel young, desired, and loved again, when I had already given up on feeling butterflies in my stomach. I solemnly promise to be not just your devoted wife, but your adventure companion, your confidant of secrets, and yes, your passionate lover until death do us part, which, considering my age, might be sooner than we'd like." The audience laughed nervously at the morbid joke, but hearing my 72-year-old mother refer to herself as my ex-husband's passionate lover in front of my traumatized children was the most nauseating and grotesque moment of the entire ceremony. Lucas lowered his head with palpable visceral shame, his young face blushing with deep embarrassment at having to witness his septuagenarian grandmother talking about being the sexual lover of his middle-aged father. Sophia, still processing with her 8-year-old mind, looked confused between the adults, desperately trying to understand why everyone was so serious and emotional, why her mother seemed about to cry, why her brother seemed to want to disappear into the marble floor. Beatrice, seated in the front row in her red dress that my mother had also chosen, maintained a forced mannequin smile that couldn't completely hide her own growing discomfort with the situation, even she who had always been complicit with maternal whims. When Father Antonio, with visible moral reluctance and a mechanical voice devoid of emotion, asked if anyone had any objection to the union, the silence in the church was dense and oppressive like molten lead. For an eternal and insane moment, I seriously considered standing up and shouting all the reasons why that marriage was a moral abomination, a generational perversion, a crime against family nature. But Roberto's threatening warning glance and the vulnerable presence of my children kept me in forced and cowardly silence. The priest, visibly relieved that no one had publicly objected, quickly proceeded with suspicious haste. Then, by the powers vested in me by the Holy Roman Catholic Apostolic Church, albeit with deep moral reservations I keep in my heart, I pronounce you, husband and wife. May God have mercy on your souls. You may kiss the bride. The kiss that followed, my 45-year-old ex-husband in the prime of his life, passionately kissing my 72-year-old mother at the sacred altar where we had married 18 years before when we were still young and believed in eternal love, was an image that permanently burned into my retina and memory like a branding iron, as the definitive and grotesque symbol of the complete, total, and irreparable destruction of any traditional, healthy, or even comprehensible notion of family structure. The kiss lingered inappropriately, with Roberto holding my mother's wrinkled face between his hands while she clung to him as if fearing he might flee, and the flashes of the cameras immortalized that moment of triumphant perversion for sick posterity. The luxurious reception that followed the religious ceremony was held in an elegant banquet hall decorated with vulgar extravagance. Imported white and golden flowers on every available surface, round tables for 10 people covered with Egyptian linen tablecloths, elaborate centerpieces with rare orchids that must have cost the equivalent of a common family's monthly salary, money that my mother had saved during decades of austere widowhood and was now frantically spending trying to buy social validation for her aberrant union with her former son. In-law. I was forced by sadistic protocol to sit at the main table of honor, strategically positioned between the perverse, happy couple and my emotionally destroyed children, smiling for hundreds of photos that would eternalize my maximum humiliation, while distant relatives who barely knew me made well-intentioned but painfully ignorant comments about how beautiful and inspiring it was to see the whole family united, and how Roberto was a wonderful son-in-law who took such good care of Margaret, without noticing the grotesque irony that he had literally stopped being a son-in-law to become my stepfather in a generational inversion that defied nature. The moment of the obligatory maid of honor speech was particularly cruel in its demand for public hypocrisy. With a throat dry as the Sahara Desert and violently shaking hands, I held the microphone as heavy as if it were a weapon pointed at my own head and said the emptiest, falsest, and most painful words of my entire life. I wish that Margaret and Roberto find all the happiness they seek in this new phase of their lives and that this union brings peace and harmony to our modern and unconventional family. I couldn't say anything more without vomiting or screaming, my voice failing and dying as I sat back down under the polite but enthusiastic applause of guests who didn't realize that my words were a curse, barely disguised as a blessing, an epitaph for the funeral of my relationship with my mother. Roberto had the psychopathic audacity to hug me after my speech, wrapping me in his arms as if he still had that right, whispering in my ear with champagne breath, "Thank you for being mature and civilized about this, Helena. The children need to see that we are all evolved and modern adults. Your mother and I greatly appreciate your public support." His hypocrisy in thanking me for my forced support gave me physical nausea that I had to control with superhuman willpower. During the traditional newlywed waltz that my mother had insisted on performing despite the obvious inappropriateness of a septuagenarian dancing as a virgin bride, Roberto led her across the dance floor with the same practiced confidence he had demonstrated at our wedding 2 decades earlier, spinning her with calculated care not to reveal too much of her age-related physical limitations, while she clung to him with senile desperation disguised as passion, her wrinkled fingers dug into his tuxedo like talons of a bird of prey protecting its catch. The live band she had hired for a fortune was playing "The Way You Look Tonight," the same cursed song that had been our first dance as husband and wife, in a coincidence that couldn't be accidental but rather an additional cruelty orchestrated to maximize my humiliation. Sophia pulled my hand with childish force. "Mommy, why are you crying? Is it because you're happy for Grandma?" My teacher said sometimes people cry from happiness at weddings. How to explain to an 8-year-old child that her tears were of deep mourning for the funeral of family dignity? for the violent death of any normal relationship with my mother, for the irreparable destruction of the family structure that should protect and nurture her? Yes, my love. I'm very emotional. I lied with a choked voice, hugging her fragile little body as if I could physically protect her from the psychological perversity she was witnessing. Lucas, on the other hand, had taken refuge in a dark corner of the hall with his cell phone, trying to completely dissociate from reality through violent games, his closed and defensive body posture clearly signaling his desire to disappear. To not exist at that moment and space where his grandmother and his father performed a grotesque nuptial dance. When I approached him, he muttered without taking his eyes off the screen. "Mom, when I grow up, I swear I'll never get married. Marriage is a disgusting lie, a ridiculous farce. Look what Dad and Grandma are doing to us." The line of congratulations after the waltz was an endless parade of refined social torture. Each distant relative, each senile friend of my mother, each acquaintance who approached to congratulate the beautiful couple and comment on the inspiring love that overcame prejudices was an additional stab in my already lacerated chest. Aunt Carmen, an octogenarian with early Alzheimer's who barely recognized people, hugged me in confusion. "Dear Helena, your father looks so handsome today. But why is Margaret wearing a wedding dress if you're the daughter getting married?" Her confusion, mixing generations and family roles, ironically captured perfectly the chaos we were experiencing. "Aunt, Dad died 5 years ago. That's Roberto, my ex-husband. He's marrying my mother," I explained slowly, each word a painful admission of our dysfunction. She looked at me even more confused, her clouded eyes trying to process the impossible information. But that makes no sense at all, child. How can your mother marry your husband? That's a mortal sin." Even a lady with dementia perceived the fundamental perversity of the situation. The cutting of the 5-tier cake decorated with sugar flowers and edible pearls was another moment of exquisite public humiliation. Roberto fed my mother the first piece with nauseating intimacy, the white icing staining her lips, which he cleaned with his finger before licking it. An intimate and sexual gesture completely inappropriate that made several guests look away embarrassed. Sophia clapped, thinking it was romantic, while Lucas ran toward the bathroom, clearly to throw up his dinner. I followed him worriedly, finding him kneeling over the toilet, his thin body trembling with spasms. "This is disgusting, Mom! Disgusting!" he shouted between heaves, tears of anger and frustration streaming down his face. "Everyone at school will know. They'll make fun of me for the rest of my life. How will I explain that my father married my grandmother? That now he's my grandfather and father at the same time? It's sick." I hugged him while he sobbed, his adolescent body trembling against mine, both momentarily united in our shared repulsion for the grotesque spectacle we were forced to witness and validate with our presence. When we returned to the hall, the horror exponentially worsened. My mother had changed clothes for the second part of the party, now wearing a red dress with a neckline inappropriate for her age and a side slit that revealed legs with varicose veins and age spots. Roberto had removed his jacket and loosened his tie, his face flushed from excessive alcohol, and they were dancing closely to the sound of modern sensual music that my mother had clearly chosen to appear young and cool. Seeing my septuagenarian mother grinding against my ex-husband to the sound of reggaeton was an image that no amount of future therapy could erase from my traumatized memory. Beatrice approached with her wine glass, her smeared lipstick indicating she had drunk too much. "Helena, you need to relax and accept it. Mom looks like a love-struck teenager. I've never seen her so happy and alive." Yes, it's strange and kind of gross to imagine them having sex. But love is love, regardless of the circumstances. The casualness with which she mentioned our elderly mother having sex with my ex-husband caused such a violent wave of nausea that I needed to hold on to the table to avoid falling. "Beatrice, you don't understand because it wasn't you who shared a bed with him for 15 years. It wasn't you who bore his children. It wasn't you who was systematically cheated on and humiliated," I replied with distilled venom. "It's very easy to be understanding and modern when it's not your dignity being publicly destroyed, when it's not your children being psychologically damaged by this family aberration." She looked at me with that expression of superiority she inherited from our mother. "You've always been dramatic and a victim, Helena. Maybe if you had been a better wife, Roberto wouldn't have found in Mom what was lacking in you." The calculated low blow made me see red, and for a moment I seriously considered throwing my champagne glass in her face, but Sophia's presence stopped me. The moment of the best man and maid of honor speeches was particularly revealing of the unhealthy dynamic. Roberto's friend Carlos, clearly uncomfortable but trying to maintain male loyalty, gave a generic speech about love having no age and second chances in life, carefully avoiding mentioning that the bride was the groom's ex-mother-in-law. Meanwhile, my mother's friend, Dona Marta, a rich and shallow widow, was more explicit in her approval. Margaret proves that we, mature women, still have a lot of love and passion to offer. She didn't let hypocritical social conventions prevent her from living her great love. She's an inspiration to all of us. During her speech, I noticed several elderly ladies looking at their sons-in-law with renewed and speculative interest, as if my mother had opened a generational Pandora's box, legitimizing inappropriate senile desires. The public normalization of this family perversion was planting sick seeds in other families, and I was powerless to prevent the moral contagion. The official photographer insisted on a complete family photo that would become the definitive symbol of our dysfunction. Roberto in the center, embracing my mother as wife on one side and with his arm over Lucas's shoulders as father on the other. Sophia on my mother's lap, who was now simultaneously her grandmother and stepmother. Me standing rigidly beside them like a pillar of salt, and Beatrice smiling falsely, completing the pathological picture. "Say happy family," instructed the photographer, oblivious to the cruel irony of the request. The resulting photo, which my mother later framed and hung in the living room as a trophy of her perverse conquest, perfectly captured the surreal horror of our new family configuration. Forced smiles hiding deep trauma, physical proximity masking emotional repulsion, a family that was actually a case study in generational perversion. Around midnight, when the party was at its peak with Roberto's friends too drunk to maintain appearances and making increasingly explicit jokes about my mother being lucky to have snagged a younger stallion, Sophia fell asleep exhausted in my lap, her little body relaxed in unconsciousness being the only moment of genuine peace in that hell. Lucas had disappeared hours ago, later texting that he was sleeping in the car because I can't stand to see this filth anymore. I held my sleeping daughter like a talisman against the madness around me, her warm and familiar weight anchoring me to reality. Roberto and my mother then began distributing wedding favors. Small golden boxes with sugared almonds and a card with their photo and the inscription, "Margaret and Roberto, love has no age, 05/25." The date hit me like lightning. It was exactly 3 years after our divorce had been finalized, meaning they had deliberately chosen that date to maximize the perverse symbolism of the situation. Every detail had been meticulously planned to twist the knife in the wound. "Helena, dear," my mother approached with her Medusa smile. Her red lipstick smudged, giving her a vampiric appearance under the venue lights. "Roberto and I are leaving now for the hotel. Can you take the children home? Oh, and starting Monday, they can visit us in the new house we bought together by the lake. It will be wonderful to have a real home where we can be a complete family." The casual revelation that they had bought a house together without informing me, creating a parallel family home where my children would be exposed to their sick relationship, was the final blow. "You bought a house? With what money?" I asked, although I already knew the answer. "With the inheritance your father left me and which I invested wisely all these years," she replied proudly. "It's a beautiful house with 5 bedrooms, a pool, and a huge garden where the children can play. Roberto has already decorated a room for each of them. Sophia will have the princess room she always dreamed of, and Lucas will have a gaming studio with all the latest equipment. The manipulation through material gifts, buying my children's affection and acceptance with luxuries I couldn't provide on my teacher's salary, my mother's Machiavellian strategy. She was systematically replacing me not only as Roberto's wife, but trying to usurp my maternal role through emotional and material bribery. Mama Gaga said we'll have a pink room with a canopy bed in the new house." Sophia partially awoke, murmuring sleepily. The affectionate nickname Mama Gaga that my mother had encouraged Sophia to use caused me physical pain in my chest. It was another boundary violation, another attempt to confuse already destroyed family roles. Their triumphant exit from the venue, under a shower of rice and petals thrown by drunk and exhausted guests, was the appropriate grand finale for that theater of the absurd. Roberto carried my mother in his arms in an inappropriate display of virility, she laughing like a schoolgirl while holding the bouquet, and they entered the limousine that would take them to the honeymoon suite in a 5-star hotel where they would consummate their aberrant union. The mental image of what would happen in that suite, my ex-husband making love to my elderly mother on the rose petal, decorated bed, the same intimate gestures we had shared now directed at the wrinkled body that gave birth to me, would haunt me for months in recurring nightmares. In the empty parking lot at 2 in the morning, Carrying sleeping Sophia and looking for Lucas, I found my son sitting on the car hood staring at the stars with empty eyes. "Is it over?" he asked without looking at me. "Is the torture over?" "For today, yes," I replied, carefully placing Sophia in the back seat. "But son, this is just the beginning. Now they are officially married, legally family. We'll have to navigate this nightmare together." He finally looked at me, his brown eyes filled with a forced maturity that no pre-adolescent should have. "Mom, promise that when I grow up, you'll never do something like this to me? Never steal my wife or do something gross like that?" The absurd but genuinely concerned question made me laugh and cry simultaneously. "I promise, my love. I promise I'll be a normal mother, that I'll respect your relationships, that I'll never betray you like I was betrayed." During the silent journey home, with São Paulo sleeping past the windows, I reflected on the dystopian future awaiting us. Family gatherings where my mother would be introduced as Roberto's wife and the children's grandmother. School events where we would have to explain our aberrant family configuration. Christmas and birthdays where perversion would be normalized year after year until the children could no longer distinguish right from wrong, normal from pathological. Arriving home, I put the children to bed and watched them sleep, their faces finally peaceful after the day's trauma. How to protect them from the inevitable psychological damage. How to raise emotionally healthy adults when they were exposed weekly to such a deeply dysfunctional family dynamic. My phone vibrated with a message from Roberto. "Helena, thank you for today. Margaret is very happy. Attached is the new visitation agreement that includes alternate weekends at the lake house. My lawyer will be in touch. Your mother wants to do family therapy with all of us to harmonize the relationships. Think about it. The audacity of suggesting family therapy to normalize his perversion made me laugh hysterically until the tears returned. I threw the phone against the wall, breaking the screen, a small act of violence that did nothing to alleviate the volcanic rage I felt. The following weeks brought the forced normalization of horror. Wedding photos appeared on social media with enthusiastic comments from ignorant acquaintances about the inspiring love and modern family. My mother changed her status to married and began posting embarrassing selfies with Roberto in juvenile romantic poses, at the beach, in restaurants, on trips paid for with my father's inheritance that she now frantically spent trying to buy youth. The first weekend the children spent at the lake house was particularly traumatic. They returned full of stories about the amazing house with heated pool, home theater, and rooms specifically decorated to their tastes. Blatant material manipulation that I couldn't compete with. Sophia was especially excited. "Mommy, Grandma said we now have 2 houses, a poor house with you and a rich house with her and Daddy." The cruel division between poor house and rich house, subliminally planted by my mother, established a perverse hierarchy where I was positioned as the inferior parent, the less desirable option. Lucas, more perceptive, recognized the manipulation. "She keeps buying things for us, Mom. It's like she wants to buy our love." It's disgusting, but Sophia doesn't notice. The therapy I sought to help the children process the trauma only confirmed the severity of the psychological damage. The psychologist, Dr. Marina, an experienced professional who had seen many family dysfunctions, was visibly shocked when I explained our situation. "In 30 years of practice, I've never seen such a complex family configuration," she said diplomatically. "The children will need prolonged counseling to process this inversion of family roles. The risk of developing attachment disorders and relationship problems in adult life is significant." The sessions revealed the depth of the impact. Sophia had begun calling other older women mommy at school, confusing maternal figures in a clear manifestation of role confusion. Lucas developed severe insomnia and began showing signs of clinical depression, social isolation, loss of interest in activities he loved, occasional ideation about disappearing. Each symptom was a silent accusation against the perversity that my mother and Roberto had imposed on innocent children. Christmas that year was the pinnacle of grotesque normalization. My mother insisted on a united family Christmas at the lake house, threatening through Roberto to limit my access to the children if I didn't attend. I arrived to find a 10-foot tree decorated with expensive ornaments, excessive gifts for the children, and my mother dressed as Mrs. Claus in an obscene performance of Christmas youth. During the elaborate dinner with dishes that cost more than my monthly salary, my mother made a toast that crystallized all the perversity. "To our unique and special family, may we overcome prejudices and live our true love." Roberto kissed her passionately in front of the children, who looked away embarrassed. Sophia began to cry without understanding why. and Lucas simply got up and went to his room, locking the door. It was at that moment that I made the most difficult decision of my life: to move to another city with the children, to start over far from that madness, even if it meant a brutal legal battle. I secretly began looking for jobs in other cities, saving every penny, preparing our escape from this emotional prison. The final straw came 3 months later, when Sophia arrived from school with a disturbing drawing, our family tree that the teacher had requested, where she had drawn Roberto simultaneously as father and grandfather, with confusing arrows connecting everyone in an incomprehensible web. The teacher had called, concerned, "Helena, Sophia is showing worrying signs of family confusion. The other students are bullying her, calling her family weird. She urgently needs professional help." That night, while the children slept, I called my cousin in Florianopolis who had offered help. Within 2 months, I had secured a job transfer, rented a small but decent apartment, and prepared all the legal documentation. The escape was planned with military precision. We left on a Tuesday dawn while Roberto and my mother were on another of their grotesque romantic trips. The message I left was simple: we are starting a new life away from the perversion you created. The children deserve to grow up in an emotionally healthy environment. Don't look for us. The legal battle that followed was brutal, but necessary. With the help of a feminist lawyer specialized in psychological abuse cases, I gained full custody by presenting evidence of the emotional damage that the non-traditional family configuration was causing. Sophia's disturbing drawings, therapy records, school reports about bullying, everything built a solid case about the toxic environment that Roberto and my mother had created. Today, 2 years later, we live in a quiet coastal town where no one knows our history. The children are in therapy, slowly processing the trauma. Lucas has started to smile occasionally and is making friends. Sophia has stopped confusing family roles, although she still has nightmares where Grandma and Daddy appear as amalgamated monsters. I receive angry emails from my mother, now 74 years old, complaining that Roberto is distant, that he's found a mistress his own age. The poetic irony of her experiencing the betrayal she imposed on me brings me no joy, only a melancholic confirmation that perversions generate more perversions in an infinite cycle. I've blocked all contacts, changed surnames. We rebuilt our life from the ashes of that family destruction. The children sometimes ask about their grandparents, and I answer honestly in an age-appropriate way. Some families get sick and need to separate to heal. We're healing now. At night, I still have nightmares about the wedding, about Sophia's cry calling Roberto Grandpa, about my mother's wedding dress, about that kiss at the altar. But in the morning, I see my children having breakfast in a simple but normal kitchen, in a small but healthy family, and I know I made the right choice. Some perversions are irreparable. Some family ties, when distorted beyond recognition, need to be surgically cut like tumors. The family that my mother and Roberto created was an aberration that needed to die so my children could live. This is my testimony, my denunciation, my cry in the dark for other mothers and children trapped in unhealthy family webs. Flee. Save yourselves. Start over. Shared blood does not justify the destruction of sanity. The generational perversion that I witnessed and lived continues to exist somewhere, in that lake house where a senile woman and a middle-aged man perform a grotesque parody of love. But we, the survivors, the refugees from that family war, have found peace in distance, sanity in separation, and perhaps, someday, forgiveness in forgetting. Did you like Helena's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.